Hi, folks. This is a re-record of the tutorial from Tuesday. There were some technical issues with Zoom because they had a lot of volume, obviously. So I'm just doing another re-record, and this one I'm going to upload to probably to YouTube, just so that folks can see this sooner rather than later. So again, this is the tutorial week 10 video. We're going to be doing Trivariate Crosstabs. My name is John Santos. I'll be TAing for the remainder of the semester. Just a little bit about me. I actually finished my MA at the U of C a couple years ago. Right now, I'm taking some open studies courses in political science to prep for a PhD program next year. Yeah, and I'm just coming into TA the remainder of the semester. And my research is in political behavior, and specifically the application of quantitative methods to political behavior. So a little bit different of a background than Dr. Tuxhorn. And so some of the examples I'm going to use are going to be a little bit different, and you'll see that here. I don't have office hours per se, but we do have the drop-in lab periods Wednesdays and Thursdays at noon, and that'll be in my personal meeting room, and you can see that is in Zoom right there. And also my email address is john.santos1@ucalgary.ca. If you have any questions, you can get a hold of me there. But otherwise, we'll get started on tutorial week 10, and we're going to be doing part of Statistics Coach Lab 6, the answers to which I actually posted on D2L yesterday. So you're welcome to work through that and do some self-assessment using the answer key, but we'll work through at least part of that lab today. So just to start off with, let's review this conceptually. So you've already looked at bivariate relationships. Now we're looking at trivariate relationships. And the first example I'm going to use is going to be from my field of political behavior. And so, there's this question: are the religious more likely to be right-wing, right? And so this is suggesting that there's a relationship between religiosity and ideology. And the idea there is that the probability of religious folks of identifying with a particular place on the ideological spectrum, let's say being right-wing. So there's a probability of being right-wing associated with folks who are very or somewhat religious. And that probability is different from the probability of those who consider themselves to be not very or not at all religious and being right-wing. So the probability of being right-wing amongst very or somewhat religious folks is not equal to the probability of those who are not very and not at all religious, right? So that's what it means to have this bivariate relationship, right? And so when we look at that, I ran this using the 2015 Canadian election study, the CES, which is on the tutorial data sets section of D2L if you want to double check my work. And so this is a simple bivariate crosstab, right? So, importance of religion is the independent variable, and then ideological identification is the dependent variable, right? And we think that there's a relationship here. And sure enough, those who are left-wing or centrist, 75% of those for whom religion is not very or not at all important identify as centrist, versus only 64% of those who say who says religion is very or somewhat important, right? So that's a gap of 11 points. This is a 2 by 2, and so the gap is the same amongst the other category of the dependent variable, right? So we see that amongst those who say that religion is very or somewhat important, 36% of them say they are right-wing, and amongst those who say they are not very or not at all religious, or that religion is not very or not at all important to them, 25% of them identify as being right-wing, right? And so we see this gap of 11 points where religious folks are 11 points more likely to identify as right-wing, and non-religious folks are 11 points more likely to identify as left-wing compared to those folks who are religious. right? But if I go back to the slide, conceptually speaking, there are other relevant variables. And I suggested one here as education, right? Because we know that there is also a relationship between education and ideology. This usually manifests itself with more educated folks being less likely to identify as being right wing than less educated folks, and less educated folks being more likely to identify as right wing than more educated folks. And so, how to incorporate this into our original model? Well, we can expand it. We can factor in somebody's education, which I've operationalized here as whether or not somebody has a university degree. And so, what we're saying here is that the difference in probabilities between the religious and the non-religious in identifying in a particular way with ideology, that's different amongst those without a university degree than it is between those who have a university degree, right? And so in our original model, we said that to have a relationship for an independent variable to have a relationship with the dependent variable, there has to be a difference in probabilities amongst the categories of the independent variable, right? That's what this is, right? The probability of identifying, let's say, as a right winger is different amongst the religious folks versus the non-religious folks. Well, here, what we're saying is that difference in probability between religious folks and non-religious folks is different amongst those who have no university degree than it is amongst those with a university degree, right? So the difference, or there's a difference between the differences, right? And so the probabilities associated with each category of the independent variable is different depending on the category of the control variable, right? Or the moderator variable. So these two probabilities that we use to calculate the relationship between X and Y are different at categories of Z, right? And that's why if we go back to the crosstab, the gap here is 11 points, right? So left or folks who say religion is very or somewhat important to them are 11 points more likely to identify as right wing than those who say that religion is not very or not at all important. Similarly, those for whom religion is not very or not at all important are 11 points more likely to identify as left wing or centrist than those for whom religion is very or somewhat important. And so when we do a trivariate crosstab, is we simply split up the population into two groups, those who have a university degree and those who do not have a university degree, and we repeat that same bivariate analysis amongst those two categories that we're controlling from, right? And so this is looking at the relationship between ideology and religion amongst those with no university degree. And this table, or this part of the table, is looking at the relationship between ideology and importance of religion amongst those with a university degree. So it allows us to control for different conditions of some control variable or moderator variable, right? And so we went from one crosstab to two crosstabs, or sometimes this is called a crosstab with two partial tables, right? And a partial crosstab is simply a crosstab that looks at the bivariate relationship between X and Y, but only amongst a particular category of Z. So if Z, our control variable or moderator variable, has two categories, our crosstab now has two partials, one for each category of Z. And we can see that the difference between categories of X is different, right? Here, the difference between categories of X is 11 points. Whereas here, amongst those with no university degree, the difference is 5.3 percentage points, right? So amongst those with no university degree, those who are very or somewhat religious are 5 percentage points more likely to identify as right wing than those who are not very or not at all religious. Conversely, Amongst those with a university degree, the gap has widened, right? So amongst those with a university degree, those for whom religion is very or somewhat important to their lives are 17.9 percentage points more likely to identify as right wing than those who for whom religion is not very or not at all important, right? And again, because this is a 2 by 2 table, the gap in one category of the dependent variable is the same as the gap for the other category of the dependent variable, right? So the nature of, or the size of the relationship, sometimes the nature of the relationship as well, is different amongst different categories of our control variable or moderator variable. So that's all that's going on in a crosstab. And so the exercise that we'll go through together in SPSS is Lab 6 in the Stats Coach, and that starts on page 57, Lab 6 application. And we're gonna walk through this problem together. And so they present this hypothetical research question: is there a relationship between sex, or the sex of the respondent, and willingness to cohabit, right? Or willingness to live in a common law relationship? That's a domestic partnership that's not within the formal legal institution of marriage. Bear in mind this example is from 2001. That's why sex is coded as binary, man or woman, right? And so the theory that they've suggested here is that men are more likely to be willing to cohabit or to live in a common law relationship than women. And there's excuse me. There's numerous possible. I promise I don't have COVID-19. Not that it matters, since we're not meeting in person. But and so they offer this suggestion that men are more likely to be willing to cohabit or to live common law than women. And one possible explanation for this is that traditional gender norms, there are gender differences in how we evaluate the morality and perhaps the purity of people, and that women pay a higher social price when they cohabit, or the term back in the old days was to live in sin, as it were. And women pay a higher social price in that than men, and that's why men might be more willing to cohabit. And so we can actually we can think about this causal relationship this way, right? And we can do that analysis by going to our GSS data set. So if you're in D2L, you can download this by going to Content, and then Lab Material, and it's the GSS 2001 S file. And when you download that, you'll get this very much abbreviated data set. And we can perform a simple bivariate crosstabs, right? So analyze, descriptive statistics, and then crosstabs. And I always like to right-click or option-click for the Mac folks on the variable list so that I see the variable names, not the labels. And we will do sex of the respondent in the columns. That's our IV. And then our DV is willing, or willingness to live common law. And always make sure you select cells, column, percentages, right? So under cells, column, percentages. And we can run that analysis, and we get this crosstab here, right? So men, 62.2% of men are willing to live common law, but only 35.8% of women are willing to live common law. So that's a difference of 26.4 percentage points, or almost twice, right? So men are almost twice as willing to live common law than women. Or I guess, sorry, so males and versus females, since we are talking about sex and not gender here, right? So that's a gap between the sexes of 26.4%, right? That's quite a big gap. And in fact, we see majorities along the diagonal So we did compute lambda, but lambda would be quite high for this relationship, right? But and then to sort of express that in terms of probabilities, the probability of men willing to live common law is different from the probability of women willing to live common law, right? But we know that that this isn't the full story. Sex does not explain the full story here. There's other relevant variables, and I came up with two here. One is religiosity, and another one is education. And the religiosity one is actually the one that the stats coach exercise works through. And so what does this look like in terms of a causal diagram? Well, we know that there's a difference in probabilities between men and women in terms of willingness to cohabit. Well, what we're saying is that the difference in probabilities between the sexes is different depending on whether or not somebody is religiously observant or not religiously observant, right? So there's a gap between the sexes in willingness to cohabit amongst religious folks, and there's a gap between the sexes in terms of willingness to cohabit amongst non-religious folks. And this gap between the sexes is different depending on whether or not we're looking at religious folks or non-religious folks, right? And so the gap between the sexes is not equal between religious folks and not religious folks, right? So we're simply examining the same bivariate relationship, but we're examining it for separate categories of some control or moderator variable. And so let's do that in SPSS, where you're going to run the same crosstab, but slightly more complex, right? So analyze, descriptive statistics, crosstabs, and SPSS has preserved our setup. You might have been wondering what this third box is called layer. Well, that's simply where we introduce our control or moderator variables, right? And so we are going to look at RL attend, which is religious service attendance, right? So that's how they operationalize the concept of religiosity. So we'll add that there. Again, make sure cells, column percentages are selected, and we will press OK. And so whereas we had a simple bivariate crosstab before, now we have a series of partial bivariate crosstabs, right? So they're partialed out because this crosstab that we originally ran is for the entire population, whereas here we have a bivariate crosstab for at least once a week of religious service attendance. And then we have the same bivariate crosstab, right? Sex, IV, willing, DV, but only for those who go to religious service once a week, right? So we now have a partial crosstab for those who are religiously observant, and we have a partial crosstab for those who are not religiously observant. And then for convenience sakes, SPSS gives you a total crosstab here. But be careful when looking at this, because look at the number of cases for our original crosstab, 5,820. Whereas here, our total crosstab is only 4,554. And that's because 5,820 people answered these two questions, sex and willingness to live common law, but only 4,554 people answered all three questions, namely sex, willingness to live common law, and religious service attendance, right? So as a guideline, you generally want to start by analyzing the bivariate crosstab for the entire population, and then you want to look at the partials for the different categories of the control variable, and the total here you shouldn't pay attention to too much. But let's look at the gaps, right? And so the gap between the sexes in terms of willingness to live common law amongst the religiously observant, right? 26.8 minus 9.8, right? So that's 17 points, right? So remember, the gap in the population as a whole is 26.4 points. But here, it's only 17 points amongst those who attend religious services at least once a week. If we look at those who attend religious services less than once a week, so the not very or not at all religious, we see that the gap between the sexes is 25.2%, or percentage points, right? So very similar to our original gap of 26.4 percentage points. So the relationship across the population as a whole tends to be pretty similar amongst those who are not very religiously observant. But amongst those who are religiously observant, the gap has diminished. What is that? 17 divided by 20. 6.4, the original gap, right? So the gap is only 64% of the original gap. And if we're comparing the gap amongst the religiously observant versus the non-religiously observant, what do we have here? 17 divided by 25.2. So 67%, right? So the gap amongst the religiously observant is 2/3 that of the gap amongst those who are not religiously observant. And you can see the probabilities, right? The probabilities themselves changed. 26.8% of religiously observant men are willing to live common law versus 9.8% of religiously observant women. Whereas amongst those who are not religiously observant, 68.5% of non-religious men are willing to live common law versus 43.3% of non-religious women, right? So the probabilities changed as well. So there's still a gap between the sexes, but the gap diminishes for those who attend religious services at least once a week. And so that suggests that the nature of this bivariate relationship is different for different categories of our control variable or moderator variable, which is religious service attendance. And so Dr. Tuxhorn, I think on Wednesday today, and perhaps a little bit more on Friday, is going to talk more about the interpretation of this. But this would be an example of a split pattern where the partials look different from one another. The partial tables, the partial bivariate tables here, depending on the categories of the moderator variable. And so this would be what we would call an interaction or an interactive effect, sometimes known as a moderation effect, once we introduce some control variable Z. Actually, with that, you pretty much have all the tools necessary to complete Lab 6 in Statistics Coach. And again, I posted the answer key to Stats Coach here on D2L, right? So Stats Coach Lab Solutions, you can see all of the solutions are there. I'm going to work through one more example here, just because I think it's useful. And, I said religiosity is a factor. That's the one in the book. Another factor might be education, right? The idea that we know more educated folks are more likely to be socially progressive or morally permissive than less educated folks. And so that might, change the nature of the relationship between sex and willingness to cohabit, right? And so operationally speaking, again, right, having a university degree or some post-secondary education, the gender gap or the gap between the sexes in terms of willingness to cohabit is going to be different from the gap between the sexes on willingness to cohabit amongst those without a university degree or without post-secondary education. And so we can go and test that in SPSS by running a trivariate crosstab again. So once again, that's analyze, descriptive statistics, crosstabs. Instead of religious service attendance, we're going to click on that. Click the left arrow to move it back to our variable list, and we're going to find not education, because this is an ordinal one. I want to select this one called has PSE. So this is somebody who has any form of post-secondary education. We're going to use that as our layer or control or moderator variable, and I'm going to select cells, make sure that our column percentages are there, and we'll press OK. So again, recall that the original gap between the sexes was 26.4 points. Well, amongst those with only a high school diploma, 62.3% of men are willing to cohabit versus only 37.3% of women. And so this difference is 25 percentage points. And it looks quite similar to the original table. You know, it also looks very similar to the partial for those who are religiously non-observant. But if we look at those who have any kind of post-secondary education, 69.7% of men are willing to cohabit, and 51% of women are willing to cohabit. That gap between the sexes is 18.7 percentage points, right? So we went from a gap of 26.4 percentage points across the entire population as a whole, a gap between the sexes of 26 points, to a gap between the sexes of 25 points amongst those with a high school diploma only, and a gap of 18.7 points amongst those with any form of post-secondary education, right? And so, you know, just looking at that in a relative sense, 18.7 divided by 25, right? So the gender gap is 3/4 of the size amongst those with post-secondary compared to those without any post-secondary. And so we see that, again, that gender gap is different amongst categories of our control variable or moderator variable, and this suggests that this is an interactive or interaction or a moderation relationship between X, Y, and Z. This one is not in the stats coach, but you can always replicate this example yourself in SPSS and use this video as a guide to check your work. So yeah, I would highly recommend that you work through the statistics coach. As you look at this tutorial video, you can follow along as well. If you find any of my explanations aren't that good, I appreciate that everyone's learning styles are different. You might prefer step-by-step illustrated instructions rather than a video tutorial. In that case, I would refer you to SPSS Essentials. That's also in the stats coach. Starting on page 143, they have an illustrated step-by-step guide on generating Trivariate crosstabs, and you can use that as another resource to help you do your current lab assignment. Anyway, I'm going to stop the video recording here. If you do have any questions, shoot me an email. I'm going to upload this video to YouTube so that it's easily available for folks and we don't have to wait for the delays in the Zoom interface. And my email address is john.santos1@ucalgary.ca. And I will be back Thursday at noon to do another drop-in lab tutorial. There's not going to be a video demonstration then, but I will be on hand if you want to ask questions to me, or if you have questions about the SPSS, I'm happy to sort of walk you through the point-and-click interface on SPSS. That's it for now, and I will meet you folks virtually, if not tomorrow, then next Tuesday for our next live laboratory.